Hey Joe,
Hey, Michelle, how are you?
how are you doing?
It's election day.
It's election day. I've got my gray shirt on. We'll see if
Yeah,
I might change from my black shirt just to step up with my suit for when I go to the polls.
yeah,
So yeah, it's election day.
yeah. If Armageddon's coming, it better hurry.
Oh, it might come. It just might be like Wednesday,
Wednesday,
Wednesday, maybe Thursday.
it's all
Might
right.
involve something like Wisconsin or Florida or Pennsylvania.
Yeah,
Who knows?
I'm in no rush.
Well, I think I need it to be over. I grew up in a country where parliamentary elections, national elections, last about 7 weeks. So these 2 year cycles of elections is just I've never gotten used to it. So
It's a
I don't know how
lot.
y'all put up with it.
There's a
Because
lot
let's
of,
face it, whatever happens, whoever loses, whatever party is not in power in the White House, there will be a conversation in about 4 weeks. Well, maybe we'll wait until after January about who's running for president of 2024.
mm.
Y'all are just like, oh, it's a lot.
It's like college football. I mean, when it's not in season, you're always talking about the next season. And so it always feels like it's in season. And I wonder if the commonality between the two is the amount of money riding on each.
Oh, that may be, maybe that's why capitalism is a tough one for me to deal with. And speaking of capitalism and speaking of other ways, we have a reading from Acts today that we're going to share. You ready
I,
for it?
I hope you'll read it for us.
I will. Here we go. So this is from Acts 4, Acts of the Apostles being the book after Luke. Luke Acts is common author. So this is the early church, and this is directions to the early church. Um, the whole congregation of believers was united as one heart, one mind. They didn't even claim ownership of their own possessions. No one said, "That's mine, you can't have it." They shared everything. The apostles gave powerful witness to the resurrection of the Master Jesus, and grace was on all of them. And so it turned out that not a person among them was needy. Those who owned fields or houses sold them, and they bought the price of the sale to the apostles and made an offering of it. The apostles then distributed it according to each person's need. And that is the early church,
Mm.
according to Luke.
How far we've come.
Well, just I guess it depends. Although I will say that's probably page 1C in the Cult Masters book of collections of things to read to people, isn't it?
Sounds about
Right?
right.
Which
And-
actually probably did I ever tell you about my friend Terry Parsons? Terry used to work for the National Church, and she's Terry of blessed memory. She died a few years ago, but she used to say to me, Michelle, the biggest mistake God ever made was putting humans in charge of distribution. Everything else hinges on us saying, "Hey, that's mine. You can't have that. Don't even look at that. It's mine."
Mm.
Right? God shouldn't have put us in charge of distribution because look what happened.
Yeah. Um, so I'm curious. I know we are here on election day. I don't, I have it somewhere. In fact, I don't have it within reach, but I've got my ballot. You can't see it, but it's sitting right behind me. And as soon
Mm-hmm.
as I get off this call with you, I'm going to turn it in. So
Yeah.
I feel like it's my responsibility as a pastor to people to
Mm-hmm.
encourage them, whoever they are, whoever they plan to vote for, or if they don't know, to go out and to exercise their vote and their voice and to be part of
Mm-hmm.
this messy thing we call democracy, because it is important that everybody we all have a stake in the outcome, so we should all have a stake in the process. So,
It's funny. I preached a couple of weeks ago, and what I thought I was preaching on was voter suppression and the Voters' Rights Act, and a great book by a guy named Ari Berman. And Joe, actually, I think this is your fault. We had this conversation 2 Tuesdays ago, I think, and it got me thinking. So that's what I preached on the following Sunday, and then I kind of got it handed to me during sermon seminar that people were a little appalled that I was telling them to vote because, of course, they were going to go vote, and that, and then it went so far as to say that Jesus. I don't know if I feel like I've told you this story, so maybe you can stop me, but that Jesus would be at the border, climbing into the cage with children. And I got mad and I was like, well, no, Jesus would be flipping the tables over, freeing the children. And came stomping upstairs from my meeting. I was a little irritated and changing out of my collar. And my wife's like, are you okay? I said, well, blah, blah, blah. And I ranted the whole story out. And she looked at me, and my wife, the better theologian, said, so you don't think Jesus has been in the cage comforting the children? I'm like, no, Jesus would be flipping tables over and making this right. And she goes, well, yeah, of course. I said, so you agree with me? And she said, no, I just don't really understand why you don't think that he would be in the cages comforting the children and flipping the tables over at the exact same time. I went, who should be the priest in this family? Of course, because we are all in this together, right?
yeah.
One heart, one mind. That's what the first line of the message is that we are called to do that. And that's an old, ancient Greek idea that our heads and our hearts need to be in concert for us to get through it. And or hearts and souls, I'm sorry, it's cardiakai psych mea. It's and they would say that, what your brain and your heart and your soul are doing all points to one thing. And what I hear these disciples doing in this early church model is saying all of our hearts, all of our minds are aligned. This isn't socialist Jesus acting in the political sphere. This is something else. This is something new. And you and I were talking about this earlier. And you have a really strong feeling about where this ties in deeply into the church and into the gospel narrative and into what the gospelers are telling us about Jesus. Do you want to tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah. And, as I was reading this text before we started talking this morning, I thought, some of my Republican friends back home are going to call me up this afternoon and say, I knew you were a socialist. I knew you were a communist, you crazy people. Because, that is one way to read this passage is, well, the early church was communist, right? That's what they were. That's what they did. And yet I think there is another way to read this passage. I think there's a way to read this passage that suggests that the early church was about radical relationship in a way that perhaps maybe we struggle with today in a society, a world that promotes the individual rights and the individual entitlements and the privileges that we should all have and all of this. This idea that no one said that's mine, you can't have it. Michelle, if I could have that attitude in my house with 3 kids, that's mine, that's mine. My life would be much, much happier, I assure you. But I think what we do is there's something, is it the reptile brain or whatever that pushes us to self-preservation. We think we've got to have everything for us, else we die, or else we don't get where we're planning to go. And I feel like what's at the heart of Jesus's teachings, and a couple of weeks ago we talked about love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. This idea that loving your Lord and loving your neighbor really are the same thing, or are very related or intertwined, is pretty radical.
Mhm.
And that seems to undergird a lot of what Jesus is talking about. And I wonder if what we're seeing in this passage this morning is not the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, is not the miracle of the Eucharist, right? This idea that when people come together and are more concerned about the welfare of their neighbor than they are about their own welfare, that everyone has enough, that no one is needy in their midst. No one is saying, that's mine, gimme, gimme, gimme. I'm more concerned with, Michelle, are you cold today? I've got this, it's kind of thin, but I got this little sweater vest, and if it will help you be warm, I'm more than happy to share it with you. That's not communism. It's being careful, right? It's what we talked
Yeah.
about last week. At the moment of being careful, we find ourselves cared for.
It's interesting. It's Martin of Tours, that whose feast day is coming up. It's like November 11th, I think, or 12th. He gave his cloak away, and he would often be kind of wandering around the city cold because he'd given away his cloak yet again. And I was riding my bike the other day, and the wind was pretty howly, and I had my gloves on, and this woman walked by me, and she had grocery bags, and she was carrying her grocery bags, and her hands looked so cold. And I had this crazy notion that I should stop and give her my gloves. And I didn't, but it popped in my head, and I sort of dismissed it. And, I had another 6 blocks to go, and I got to work, and I thought afterwards, I was like, oh, maybe I should have given her my gloves. And it's just this crazy sort of thing. Like, did I deny Jesus in that moment because there was this moment where, because I guess I could have stopped and bought myself another pair of gloves. And my bike gloves probably weren't going to be particularly helpful to her because they're not warm gloves. They're just wind resistant. But yeah, it's just this crazy thing about, like, I have actual capacity to buy a second pair of gloves, and she might not.
Mm.
I don't know, but Martin of Tours would approve of you giving me your best. So I appreciate that.
And I guess I wonder, as we think about, and I started with go vote, right? And I think too
Yeah.
often in this country we see voting as an individual right. I wonder what would happen if we understood voting as a community responsibility. Our community is better when all voices are represented, when all perspectives are heard at the ballot box. And so by me not exercising that opportunity to vote, somehow there is less in the community, in terms of the representation, in terms of the political perspective. So I don't know. I started with voting, and I'm
Well,
wondering. Go ahead. Yeah.
it's interesting. You just made me think of something, because I would listen to our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, talk. He did a hour and a half long piece at the Washington National Cathedral, and you can see it on YouTube if you like. But if we move to distribution of wealth, like our stuff, I mean, there's lots of ways to look. Joe, why do I own a lawnmower and my neighbor next door owns a lawnmower and the people next door to me on the other side own a lawn? Maybe the three of us could buy one lawnmower and share it. Now, it'd be a hassle. We'd have to navigate all of those, but we don't all need to own one, right? Or we can rent it from each other, but we don't act like that. We act like I have my lawnmower and I need to keep it just the way I like it. Guy next door might borrow it and dull the blade and not tell me, and then I'll be mad. Like, come on. right? Why do we own all this stuff? Why don't we have a tool collective where there's two hammers in a shed that we all have the combination for, and we trust that they'll get back in there? Because we don't trust, right? But let's move it out of stuff, out of the way something has to happen in that one way. What if we move it to our privilege? And Michael Curry told a really interesting story in his sermon. He tells a story about Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt, first lady of our land. And meanwhile, the Tuskegee Airmen, the African-American men who were trying to fly planes in the war, wanting to serve their country, there were actual conversations about, well, Black people's lungs may not have the same capacity as white people's lungs. And once they're up in the air, their ill lungs might not be able to sustain the pressure, and then they'll pass out and the plane will crash. Which, you mean the people that y'all sent out to harvest crops in the hot sun? Like, apparently they're too weak to fly an airplane. Are we, right? So they're having this conversation, and the Tuskegee Airmen have no ability to impact this one way or the other until they're told they can fly the planes in combat. They can't prove that they've got good lung capacity. So all they do is the thing that's right in front of them. They keep training. Well, Eleanor Roosevelt gets somebody to get her down to Alabama with a bunch of newsmen, and she walks up to the airplane, points to one of the random African-American pilots and says, "Hey, take me up in the airplane." She gets in the airplane, they taxi up, fly off. They fly around for 45 minutes. The newsmen all wait around. They took pictures of the plane taking off, the newsreels, the plane coming back. She redistributed her power, her privilege, and the whole conversation about whether these men were fit to fly airplanes disappeared in the act of one woman who later on in life said that her entire time as First Lady and beyond, as she was a UN ambassador, was to bring about the Declaration and all of its principles and living more deeply into the Beatitudes. And that was her redistributing her power. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's what this is being called to, rather than our stuff. And then we move out of this conversation of socialist Jesus into, I see you, Joe. And I know that as a priest in the church, I have an ability to write a letter for you that's going to have a bishop here that you're ready to be ordained. I take that responsibility really seriously. That's my privilege that I extend to you, not because I think you deserve it or I think you're undeserving of it. I think it happens to be the truth. So that's my work, right? I extend my privilege out into the world, and I would hope that you extend your privilege out in the world when you're offering me or somebody else your vest, because you know you have capacity to maybe go get another vest, or you at least have a secondary sweater in the back of your closet, right? So I really don't know what any of that means.
I really like that. Yeah, I think that's helpful.
I just ripped it off from Brian.
That's helpful.
I just wonder. It just makes me wonder about, maybe that's what we're talking about here in an individualistic society. Is you and I built a tool share at Virginia Theological Seminary, and we also spend our priesthoods sharing our power.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And so move beyond the distribution of wealth, and we start talking about redistribution of power, of privilege, however you want to frame it. It takes it out of that political sphere, as you say, and moves it back into relationship, right? You know, in your example about you,
that's good.
With you and your 3 neighbors or 2 neighbors, all of whom have lawnmowers, you said, yeah, we could all go in and buy a lawnmower. And in your words, it caught me. You said, you know, it might be a hassle, right? And it might be, but you know, that raises the question for me: do we spend the $400
to have a lawnmower to mow a strip of grass that big, because we don't want to have to deal with the relationships that we'd have to deal with in order to lend and borrow a lawnmower. And if that's the case, then are we not depriving ourselves and our neighbor of the opportunities, the gifts, and the challenges of relationship?
Well, that's exactly right? Like here we are, like, if I don't need anything from my next door neighbor, when am I ever going to talk to that person? And if they don't need something from me, when are they going to talk to me, right? I was laughing, actually, my next door neighbor right over here, brand new neighbors. I don't know them that well. And I was listening, like a bunch of noise in their backyard. And the dog was kind of boofing a little bit. So I stuck my head out and I started massively eavesdropping, which I'm hoping is a minor sin, but I was eavesdropping. And I realized they were going to build a 6-foot privacy fence all along the perimeter of their yard. And they've been living here maybe 8 weeks, 10 weeks, something like that. Totally their right. None of the rest of us have a big old privacy fence, but and so I'm like, excuse me, they'll turn and look at me and go, hey, if you're going to build that fence, will you let me know so I'll move my raspberries? Because I need to have them have sunlight. So just let me know. And one of the owners of the home turned and looked at me and said, oh, well, we're probably not going to do it because it's a lot of money. And I said, okay. And what I heard was, we're not doing it yet because it's a lot of money, but the sooner we have the money, we're going to do it. And I went, oh, okay. And the guy who was like bidding the fence turned around and goes, yeah, it's going to be $4,800. I'm like, I didn't actually need to know that. I ran back in the house. But, I said to Michelle, I think before next year, we're going to have to move our raspberries. Right? Why am I telling you this story? I think it's just interesting that, my garden goes right to the edge of their yard, and it would have been packed. It never occurred to them to say, hey, just to let you know, we're going to build this fence. Like when I came home one day and my raspberries are mashed up against a fence and I, lost an entire season because I haven't moved them. Like and I don't think it's because he's a bad person or they're bad people. I think he just doesn't think past his fence line about what he might need, what he might need from me in the future. Because right now I'm like,
Sure.
I don't know.
So how do we, moving into this election, which we may or we may not have an answer tonight, we may or may not have an answer tomorrow, as we move into the uncertainty of our political times, how is Jesus calling us to move past our fence lines? Because Lord knows I've got my own, right? And I feel like you hit it. That's what Jesus is calling us to do. He's calling us to be more neighborly, to go deeper into relationship. And I find myself wondering that not just for me, I find myself wondering it for our community at St. Mark's. For our friends. I mean, you talked about our friend who comes around and takes a nap on the bench every now and again. We are a neighbor as a community. We are a neighbor. And so what can we be doing? And I'm not asking the question expecting an answer, but I do hope that these are questions, whatever our politics, whatever the outcome of this election, that we can be thinking about going into this new season.
I think that's right. And I think that regardless of who's president, regardless of who's running the Senate, we still have Christian principles that we're called to live into, because we aren't electing Jesus. And if we did elect Jesus, all Jesus would do is annoy the crap out of us. How I live my life is aspirational towards Jesus. Having Jesus right there going, you could probably knock on the door and bring those folks some apple crisps, because they might be feeling kind of bad that you had to call them out about their fence. And I'd be like, oh, Jesus, I don't bring them apple crisp. I like apple crisp. And they're bad people. I don't like them right now, Jesus. They don't get apple crisp. So Jesus in my life was like as an active presence.
Yeah.
I'll take my chances living my Christianity with the Republican president or the Democratic president, and that's how it's going to be. So let's just we got to get going here, because I'm sure we've gone on way too long, because people have been very kind listening to you and I ramble away at each other. But this Sunday coming up, the 8th of November at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, we're having a conversation that.
No, go ahead.
Are we going to revisit the 5 weeks of gospel that we talked about, and open it up for people to ask us questions about what we said?
Yes.
Is that what the rest of the thesis is going to be like?
Yes. I believe it's from 2 o'clock to 3:30. We will have a special edition of Wrestling with the Angel, in which our sisters and brothers in our St. Mark's community and beyond can join us to engage some of these questions and wrestle them with us. And hopefully, Michelle, by Sunday, we'll have some sense of what the world looks like. Maybe not. But, either way.
Yeah. I would actually like this a little slightly more resolved before I write my sermon. So me and Jesus have been having a conversation about midday Thursday, but we'll see how it goes.
And either way.
Just saying. For me, that would be nice.
With Zoom.
So it's like, I'd like to know by 10:05 on Tuesday.
Right. But either way, we will gather faithfully, neighborly, together at 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon and visit on some of these questions. And there will be less a lecture and more a conversation. As we do at St. Mark's, we will engage each other, I hope, in some of these texts and some of the things we've seen over this election cycle, and some of the things we've seen perhaps today on Election Day and in the days following, and ask ourselves again, how can we move past our fence line, and how are we doing that today, and how can we do that tomorrow? So I hope everyone.
All sounds good, man.
I hope everyone will join us, and I'm grateful for everyone who has been patient, as you say, with us these past 40 days of politics. I'm grateful for Jesus being patient with us as we put him
every day. Right before I go to sleep, I'm like, well, thanks, Jesus. We squeaked through another one. Glad you were walking with me. So, all right, my friend, I will see you later this afternoon at the polling place. You take care of yourself, and give my best to everybody, including all your kids who keep saying mine.
Will do, Michelle. Good to see you. Jesus2020.
All right.